Picture a world where the letters SBQR still hang over government buildings in London, in Cairo, in Paris, not as a museum relic, but as a living symbol of an empire that never stopped ruling. That's the world we're stepping into today. Because the fall of Rome wasn't inevitable. It wasn't some cosmic certainty written into the stars. It was the result of choices, mistakes, and a handful of moments where history could have easily tipped the other way. And if just a few of those moments had gone differently, the entire shape of the modern world, our borders, our languages, our religions, even the technology we use, could look almost unrecognizable. Let's start with what actually happened, because you can't understand the what if without understanding the real collapse first. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was already splitting under its own weight. It had grown too large for one government to manage efficiently. So in 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian divided it into eastern and western halves just to keep the machine running. For a while, that worked. But the western half, the one with Rome itself, plus modern-day Italy, France, Spain, and Britain, was slowly bleeding out. Corruption ate away at the government from the inside. Heavy taxation crushed the middle class. The military, once the most disciplined fighting force in the ancient world, became increasingly reliant on hired mercenaries who had no real loyalty to Rome. And on top of all that, waves of migrating peoples, Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, were pushing into Roman territory, some as invaders, some as desperate refugees fleeing chaos even further east. The breaking point most historians point to is 476 AD, when a Germanic military leader named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. No dramatic final battle, no last stand, just a quiet, almost bureaucratic transfer of power. The West was done. The eastern half, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, would actually survive for another 1,000 years, but the Rome of legend, the Rome of the Colosseum and the Senate and the legions, was gone. So where's the divergence point? Where's the single moment that could have changed everything? Most historians agree it isn't one single event. It's a cluster of decisions made roughly a century earlier, around 376 AD. That year, a massive group of Gothic refugees showed up at the Roman border, begging to be let in. They were fleeing the Huns, and they weren't looking for a fight. They wanted protection. Rome said yes. But here's the catch. The local Roman officials handling the resettlement were corrupt. They mistreated the Goths, overcharged them for food. In some accounts, even sold them dog meat at outrageous prices while their own people starved. The Goths revolted. And 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople, they crushed a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens himself. That battle is often called the beginning of the end. Now here's our point of divergence. Imagine the Roman officials handling that Gothic resettlement had actually done their jobs. Imagine the Goths were integrated fairly, given land, and folded into the Roman military and economy as loyal citizens instead of exploited outsiders. It's not a fantasy. Rome had successfully absorbed foreign peoples before. This time, though, corruption won, and it cost Rome everything. So let's rewind that one decision and walk through what a smoother, more successful integration might have set in motion. In the immediate aftermath, without the humiliation at Adrianople, the Roman military doesn't lose one of its most experienced field armies. The empire's eastern border stays stable. Emperor Valens survives, or at the very least, his successor doesn't inherit a shattered military infrastructure. More importantly, the Goths, now integrated as Roman citizens and soldiers, become a genuine asset. Rome had always been strongest when it absorbed outsiders rather than fought them. That's literally how it built its empire in the first place, granting citizenship to conquered peoples across Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. A successfully absorbed Gothic population could have added tens of thousands of skilled fighters to Rome's ranks instead of subtracting them. Move a few decades forward into the midterm. With a stronger, more ethnically diverse military and a functioning treasury no longer drained by constant border wars, Rome has the resources to actually reform its administration. Here's the thing people forget. Rome's collapse wasn't really about barbarians conquering civilization. It was about the empire eating itself from the inside through corruption, overtaxation, and an aristocracy that hoarded wealth while the empire's infrastructure crumbled. In this alternate timeline, a Rome that isn't hemorrhaging money on emergency wars has room to breathe. It can reform tax collection. It can pay its soldiers and administrators properly, which reduces the temptation for corrupt officials to skim off the top in the first place. Stronger governance early on could break the cycle that doomed the real empire. Now here's the first turn, the twist you probably didn't expect. You'd think that just means Rome sails on forever, unchallenged. But it might not have. Even in this stronger alternate Rome, the Huns are still out there, and they're still one of the most terrifying military forces in ancient history under a leader like Attila. A more stable Roman Empire in the West might have actually drawn the Huns' full attention instead of splitting it between multiple weakened successor kingdoms. In the real timeline, Attila's forces were eventually stopped at the Battle of Chalons in 451 AD by a coalition that included Romans and Visigoths fighting together, proof that Rome and the peoples it had once fought could cooperate when it mattered. In our alternate timeline, that cooperation isn't a desperate last resort. It's the default. A unified Roman Gothic military machine facing the Huns might not just survive the encounter. It might crush it, permanently removing one of history's great destabilizing forces from the map a full generation earlier than it actually happened. Let's push further into the long-term consequences, because this is where things get genuinely world-altering. A Rome that survives past the 5th century intact doesn't just mean Italy stays Roman. It means the entire trajectory of European history shifts. The power vacuum that allowed the Frankish kingdoms, and eventually Charlemagne's empire, to rise never opens up the same way. Instead of fragmenting into hundreds of competing feudal territories over the following centuries, continental Europe might remain under a centralized administrative system, Roman law, Roman roads, Roman currency, for far longer. Feudalism as we know it, that patchwork of lords, vassals, and castles that defined medieval Europe for 1,000 years, might never fully develop, because feudalism largely emerged as a response to the collapse of centralized Roman authority and the need for local protection against invaders. Think about what that means for something as basic as language. In our real world, Latin fractured into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian as regional dialects drifted apart after Rome's administrative grip loosened. In a surviving Roman Empire, with continuous administration, continuous education, and a unified legal system, Latin might have stayed remarkably intact across a much larger territory. Not identical everywhere, but far closer to a single shared language than the patchwork we ended up with. And then there's religion. Christianity had already become the empire's official faith by the time of our divergence point. So it's not like a surviving Rome erases Christianity from history. But the specific form it took, the split between Roman Catholicism in the West and Eastern Orthodoxy, a split that hardened partly because of the political and cultural gap between a collapsed West and a thriving Byzantine East, might never happen the same way. A single, continuously governed Roman Empire might have kept its church more unified for centuries longer, changing the entire religious map of Europe, the Middle East, and eventually the Americas. Here's the second turn. You'd assume a surviving Rome is just unambiguously better, more advanced, more stable, a smoother path to modern civilization. But a lot of historians would push back on that. Centralized empires, however impressive, tend to slow down innovation in certain ways. The fragmented, chaotic post-Roman Europe we actually got, with dozens of competing kingdoms, city-states, and eventually nations, created intense competition. States competed for trade, for territory, for prestige, and that competition arguably fueled the explosion of innovation that led to the Renaissance, the age of exploration, and eventually the scientific revolution. A single dominant Roman superstate, with no real rivals, might have had far less incentive to take the same risks. Imagine no fragmented, ambitious European kingdoms racing each other across the Atlantic. Someone still might have reached the Americas, but the why, the funding, the national rivalries that pushed Columbus and Magellan and later explorers might simply not exist in the same form. Here's the third and final turn, and it's maybe the most sobering one. Even a genuinely successful Rome, one that solves its 5th century crisis, still has to face something no empire in history has ever permanently escaped: time. Every empire that has ever existed, Persian, Egyptian, Mongol, British, eventually fractured, reformed, or transformed into something else entirely. Empires aren't static objects. They're constantly straining against their own size, their own diversity, their own internal contradictions. A Rome that survives the 5th century might simply push its fall forward by 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years. But the pressures that caused the original collapse, distance, communication limits, regional identity, economic inequality between provinces, don't just vanish because one crisis was managed well. It's entirely plausible that a surviving Roman Empire eventually fragments anyway, just later, and into different pieces, along different lines, shaped by different pressures we can barely predict from here. So what's the bigger lesson in all of this? It's tempting to look at history as this string of inevitable outcomes. Like Rome was always destined to fall, and the modern nation-state was always destined to rise to take its place. But that's not really how history works. Rome's fall came down to specific human choices: corrupt officials mishandling a refugee crisis, a battlefield disaster that could have gone differently, decades of policy decisions that compounded on top of each other. Change even one of those decisions, and the ripple effects touch everything. The languages spoken in half the world today, the borders drawn on modern maps, the religious institutions that shaped billions of lives, even the reason certain ships sailed toward the Americas in the first place. Empires don't fall because of fate. They fall because of thousands of small human decisions, made by ordinary corrupt officials and ambitious generals and desperate refugees, none of whom had any idea they were reshaping the next 2,000 years. And that raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. If the fate of an empire that ruled for over 1,000 years could hinge on how a handful of border officials treated a group of refugees on one particular year, what does that say about the decisions being made in the world right now? The ones that seem small, bureaucratic, forgettable, that future generations might one day look back on as the moment everything could have gone differently?